Welcome back to the channel. The system is the warning. Thank you to those of you who have been here and the ones just joining. I'm Barb Warren, and this is episode 2. They don't want you to find each other. Not really. Not in a way that leads to clarity. Not in a way that builds trust. Not in a way that turns isolation into community and community into power. They're fine with people being online together. They're fine with people being loud in fragments. They're fine with people reacting in real time and then moving on to the next thing by tomorrow. What they do not want is for people to recognize themselves and each other deeply enough to start building something that can't easily be manipulated. And that part matters because one of the oldest tactics any system uses to maintain control is isolation. If you can keep the people disconnected, you can keep the people disoriented. If you can keep them disoriented, you can keep them easier to manage. And if you can keep them believing that whatever they're feeling is theirs alone, then they're less likely to realize they're actually responding to a pattern. That's why I keep saying this is bigger than individual experience, because when people are kept apart long enough, they start personalizing what is structural. They start thinking their exhaustion is just their own, their fear is just their own, their confusion is just their own, their burnout is just their own. And I need people to understand that one of the most effective ways a system protects itself is by making you think what's happening to you is disconnected from what's happening to everybody else. That way, you never compare notes, you never build language around what you're seeing, you never realize that the same pressure is being applied in different ways to different people, all with the same goal of keeping everybody tired, distracted, suspicious, and fragmented. And when I say they don't want you to find each other, I'm not talking about friendship in some soft surface level way. I'm talking about recognition. I'm talking about the moment when you realize somebody else has been noticing the same thing you've been noticing. The moment when something you've been carrying privately finally gets spoken out loud by someone else. And all of a sudden, it has shape, it has language, it has context. That kind of recognition is dangerous to systems that depend on confusion, because once people start naming what they're seeing together, the gaslighting gets weaker. It doesn't disappear overnight, but it gets weaker. And that matters too. Look at how this works in practice. Neighborhoods get destabilized, schools are underfunded, public spaces shrink, third places disappear, work gets more demanding, more draining, more precarious. People are exhausted before they ever have the energy to think about what's happening around them. Then social media comes in and gives people the illusion of connection without always giving them the grounding of community. And yes, it can be used for good. We all know that. But it can also keep people emotionally flooded and politically scattered if they never move beyond reaction. Because being connected is not the same thing as being organized. Being visible is not the same thing as being supported. And being surrounded by noise is not the same thing as actually finding your people. That is why isolation is so useful, not because people are literally alone all the time, but because they are kept disconnected in the ways that matter most. Disconnected from history, disconnected from context, disconnected from trust, disconnected from the knowledge that what they are feeling has roots. You can have a phone full of contacts and still be politically isolated. You can have followers and still not have community. You can have people watching you and still not have people who would build with you, protect you, tell you the truth, and help you think clearly when everything around you is designed to make you second guess yourself. And that's where this gets deeper, because disconnected people are easier to contain. They don't compare experiences enough to identify structure. They don't share strategy enough to build resistance. They don't rest enough to think clearly. They don't trust enough to move together. And that's not an accident. If people ever fully understood how much power lives in shared clarity, they would stop underestimating what happens when the right people find each other at the right time, because then the conversation changes. Then you're not just venting, you're not just surviving in parallel, you're building analysis, you're building language, you're building a map. And I think sometimes people underestimate how political that really is. They think power only shows up in institutions, in elections, in policy, in boardrooms, in courtrooms. And yes, it shows up there. But power also shows up when people stop thinking they are the only one noticing something is wrong. Power shows up when people stop shrinking around each other and start speaking plainly. Power shows up when people create spaces where truth is not punished, where questions are not treated like threats, where people can grieve, strategize, laugh, and tell the truth without constantly managing someone else's comfort. That kind of community is not extra, it is not optional, it is part of survival. Let me say this too, because I think this part gets missed. Community is not about pretending everything is easy once you find each other. It is not romantic. It does not erase disagreement. It does not make everybody safe all the time, but it does create the possibility of something systems cannot easily manufacture for you, and that is grounded trust. The kind of trust that allows people to think together, the kind of trust that lets people correct each other without falling apart, the kind of trust that lets people say, no, you're not imagining this, and no, you are not alone in it either. That matters more than people realize, because a lot of folks are trying to function with no real confirmation of what they're seeing. They've been made to feel dramatic for noticing patterns, difficult for naming contradictions, divisive for asking direct questions. So when they finally find people who are also paying attention, that does something. It steadies you. Once you are steadied, you move differently. You stop performing strength while quietly falling apart. You stop thinking survival has to look lonely. You stop confusing hyper independence with freedom, because that's another lie people get sold. That isolation is strength, that needing nobody is power, that handling everything alone is some kind of victory. And maybe that sounds good in culture obsessed with individualism, but in practice, it leaves people depleted. It leaves people easier to exploit, easier to silence, easier to burn out. There is nothing liberating about being left to carry structural problems by yourself and then being praised for how quietly you carried them. When I say they don't want you to find each other, I mean they don't want you to experience the kind of connection that interrupts control. They do not want you to build the kind of relationships that make truth easier to hold. They do not want you exchanging notes across communities, across experiences, across generations, because once that starts happening, the story gets harder to manage. The narrative get harder to contain, and people stop being dependent on institutions that never intended to keep them whole in the first place. That's also why joy matters here. And I want to say that carefully, because too many people hear joy and think I mean denial. I don't. I mean the kind of joy that survives in full knowledge of what is happening, the kind of joy that does not require pretending, the kind of laughter that happens in rooms where people are still telling the truth. Systems that run on fear hate that kind of joy, because it proves they do not have total control over your spirit. And once people can feel joy together without surrendering clarity, that becomes another kind of resistance too. Not performative, not shallow, real. This is not just about making friends. This is about refusing the kind of isolation that keeps people politically weak and emotionally fragmented. It is about refusing to let every hard thing be individualized when the pattern is collective. It is about finding the people who make you sharper, steadier, clearer, and harder to manipulate. It's about building something stronger than visibility, stronger than reaction, stronger than temporary alignment, because real safety was never going to come from the same systems that benefit from your isolation in the first place. Once you understand that, You stop waiting for permission to build community that actually holds. You stop waiting to be validated by institutions that cannot imagine your wholeness. You stop thinking your survival has to happen in private, and you start moving with the kind of intention that only comes from knowing you were never supposed to do this alone. They don't want you to find each other. That's exactly why you should. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was long, but if you found it helpful, share it with someone who you believe needs to hear it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.